behind a tree. I can see it, barely.
For 30 years, loggers have vanished in the Shadowmere Mountains. Over 1,000 men gone without a trace. In October 2019, Safety Inspector Tim Bennett discovered why and witnessed Bigfoot's methodical demonstration of how each victim died. What Bennett saw in those cursed woods would haunt him forever, but no one would ever believe his testimony. The forest was wrong. Bennett felt it the moment he stepped into the investigation zone, a suffocating silence that pressed against his eardrums like cotton. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed afraid to disturb the branches overhead. 3 days into his investigation, Bennett found the first bones. They lay scattered in a clearing like broken toys, bleached white by years of mountain weather. But these weren't the remains of natural death. Every bone had been systematically shattered, crushed with deliberate precision that spoke of intelligence and malice. A human skull sat propped against a rotting log, cracked open like an egg. The fracture lines were too perfect, too methodical. Whatever had done this knew exactly where to apply pressure to split bone without destroying the contents inside. Brain matter had been scooped out while the victim was still breathing. Bennett's hands trembled as he documented the scene. Femurs snapped in half with the marrow extracted. Rib cages torn apart and scattered like pickup sticks. Finger bones arranged in neat little rows, as if someone had been counting them. The smell hit him then. Not just decay, but something else. Something alive and foul that made his stomach lurch. The stench of a predator's den, thick with the accumulated odor of countless kills. Mixed among the human remains were fragments of logging equipment, hard hats crushed flat as pancakes, safety vests shredded into ribbons, chainsaw parts scattered like confetti, their metal surfaces bearing deep gouges from claws that could slice through steel. Bennett counted bone fragments from at least 40 different people in this single clearing, 40 families who would never know what happened to their loved ones. 40 men who had died screaming in this cursed place. The bones told stories of prolonged agony. Stress fractures indicated victims had been kept alive during torture. Teeth marks on femurs showed something had gnawed on living bone. Skull fragments bore precise holes where brain matter had been extracted with surgical precision while hearts still beat. Moving deeper into the forest, Bennett discovered the trees. Ancient pines bore scars that made his blood freeze. Claw marks gouged 15 feet up their trunks, parallel grooves carved so deep they wept sap like tears. The marks weren't random. They formed patterns, symbols, messages written in a language of violence that only the creature understood. Some trees had been snapped in half like matchsticks, their massive trunks twisted and broken with impossible strength. The destruction was methodical, purposeful. This wasn't territorial marking. This was a gallery of violence, a museum of suffering displayed for anyone brave or foolish enough to venture this deep into the creature's domain. The deeper Bennett went, the more extensive the markings became. Trees bore multiple sets of gouges at different heights, chronicling years of growth and countless successful hunts. Some marks were fresh, the wood still bleeding sap. Others were old and weathered, speaking of decades of systematic terror. The claw marks formed ritualistic patterns that seemed to tell stories. Some trees bore spiraling gouges that wrapped around their trunks like twisted prayers. Others showed parallel lines that counted something, kills perhaps, or years of hunting. The creature was keeping score, documenting its work with the pride of an artist. Bennett found evidence of the creature's intelligence in the way it had arranged certain trees. Massive logs had been positioned to create barriers and channels, funneling prey into specific areas where escape would be impossible. This wasn't random destruction. It was environmental engineering designed to maximize the efficiency of the hunt. Then he heard it. Wet tearing noises accompanied the vocalizations, the crack of breaking bones, and underneath it all, something that made Bennett's skin crawl, the unmistakable sound of pleasure. Whatever was making these noises was enjoying itself. The sounds followed a pattern that spoke of intelligence. periods of intense activity punctuated by moments of silence, as if the creature was pausing to savor its work. Each vocalization carried a quality of satisfaction that was more terrifying than any roar of rage. Bennett's training told him to retreat, to call for backup, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something compelled him forward, a need to understand, to document, to bear witness to whatever horror was unfolding in the darkness ahead. The forest grew denser as he approached the source of the sounds. Ancient trees created a canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight. The air grew heavy and oppressive, thick with the smell of decay and something else, a musky animal odor that seemed to coat the inside of his nostrils. The sounds grew louder as Bennett crept forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. Each step brought him closer to something his mind couldn't fully process. The source of 30 years of terror, the answer to 1,000 disappearances. Through gaps in the undergrowth, Bennett caught glimpses of movement, something massive shifting in the clearing ahead, too large to be any known animal. The movements were deliberate, methodical, accompanied by those wet, tearing sounds that made his stomach churn. Bennett pressed himself against a massive pine tree, its bark rough against his cheek as he peered around the trunk. What he saw in that clearing would haunt him for the rest of his life. It stood 12 feet tall in a small clearing, its massive frame covered in dark, matted fur that seemed to absorb light. Its proportions were wrong. Arms too long, shoulders too broad, hands that could crush a man's skull like a grape. This was evolution's nightmare, intelligence wedded to unstoppable physical power. The creature's face was the most disturbing aspect. While its body was covered in coarse fur, its features showed expressions that were unmistakably intelligent and malevolent. Its eyes held a spark of awareness that was more terrifying than any mindless animal rage. This thing understood exactly what it was doing. But it was what the creature was doing that revealed the true horror. In its massive hands, it held a deer, not feeding on it, not killing it quickly as any natural predator would. Instead, it was torturing the animal with methodical precision, demonstrating techniques that Bennett recognized from the scattered human remains throughout the forest. The deer was still alive, still conscious, its eyes wide with terror and pain. The creature had been working on it for some time. Several of its legs were already broken, bent at impossible angles, while the animal remained aware of every moment of its suffering. Bennett watched in frozen horror as the creature's face showed unmistakable pleasure at the deer's agony. Its eyes held an intelligence that was more terrifying than any mindless animal rage. This thing understood exactly what it was doing and took satisfaction in every scream, every broken bone, every moment of terror. The creature paused in its work, tilting its massive head as if listening to something. Bennett's blood turned to ice as he realized the creature was savoring the deer's labored breathing, the small whimpers of pain that escaped its throat. This wasn't just torture. It was a symphony of suffering that the creature conducted with artistic precision. Slowly, deliberately, the creature grasped the deer's remaining unbroken leg. It looked directly at the animal's face, seeming to feed on the terror in its eyes before applying pressure. The bone snapped with a wet crack that echoed through the clearing, and the deer's scream was almost human in its agony. The creature's face showed pure ecstasy at the sound. This wasn't hunger or territorial behavior. This was addiction, a compulsion to cause suffering that had been refined through decades of practice on both animal and human victims. Bennett realized he was witnessing the exact methods used on every missing logger. The creature had been perfecting these techniques for years, practicing on animal victims before applying them to human prey. Every vanished worker had experienced this same systematic horror. The creature began working on the deer's torso, its massive hands exploring the animal's ribcage like a pianist testing keys. It applied pressure gradually, methodically, listening to the subtle changes in the deer's breathing as ribs began to crack under the strain. Each breaking rib was a note in the creature's twisted composition. It would pause after each break, tilting its head to listen to the deer's increasingly desperate gasps for air. The creature was timing the brakes, spacing them out to prolong the animal's consciousness and maximize its suffering. Bennett's hands shook as he watched the systematic torture unfold. This was how the loggers had died, all of them. 1,000 men subjected to the same methodical agony, their screams echoing through these cursed woods as the creature perfected its techniques on human prey. The creature's methods were sophisticated, refined through decades of practice. It knew precisely how much damage it could inflict without causing death, how to keep its victims conscious despite extreme trauma, how to prolong suffering for maximum effect. The creature moved to the deer's skull, but instead of crushing it immediately, it used its claws to make precise cuts in the scalp. Peeling back sections of skin to expose bone beneath, the technique was sophisticated and deliberate, designed to cause maximum pain while keeping the victim conscious for as long as possible. Those claws were perfectly adapted for this work, sharp enough to slice through skin and muscle with surgical precision, controlled enough to avoid vital structures that would end the demonstration too quickly. The creature had performed this procedure countless times, and its movements showed the confidence of extensive practice. The creature paused between acts of violence, allowing the deer to fully comprehend its situation. This wasn't just physical torture, it was psychological warfare designed to maximize terror and despair. The creature understood that fear was as important as pain in creating the perfect victim. The deer's eyes showed the same terror Bennett had seen in nightmares, the look of something that understood it was going to die slowly and painfully, that its suffering was deliberate and inescapable. The creature fed on this terror as much as it would later feed on flesh. Finally, the creature began applying pressure to the deer's skull, slowly, methodically, increasing force until hairline cracks appeared in the bone. The animal's cries grew weaker, but the creature maintained just enough restraint to keep it conscious until the very end. The skull collapsed with a wet cracking sound that seemed to echo forever in the oppressive silence of the forest. The deer's suffering ended, but the creature wasn't finished. It held up the crushed skull, examining its work with obvious satisfaction before tossing it aside to join countless other remains. As Bennett watched in horror, the creature slowly turned its massive head toward his hiding place. Those ancient, malevolent eyes locked onto his position with unmistakable intelligence. The creature had known he was there all along. A low rumble emanated from the creature's throat, not quite a growl, not quite a purr, but something that spoke of satisfaction and anticipation. It had been performing for an audience, demonstrating its methods for Bennett's benefit. Bennett's paralysis broke as the creature began to rise to its full height. 12 feet of muscle and malevolence unfolding like a nightmare made flesh. He turned to run, but his legs felt like lead, his muscles refusing to obey as terror flooded his system. Behind him, the creature made a sound that would haunt Bennett's dreams, a deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to express amusement. The creature was enjoying this moment, savoring the fear it was causing before the real work began. Bennett crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at his clothes and skin. But he could hear the creature following, not running, not hurrying, but moving with the patient confidence of something that knew it could catch its prey whenever it chose. The sounds of pursuit were deliberate and measured, heavy footsteps that crushed undergrowth and snapped branches like gunshots. The creature wasn't trying to be stealthy. It wanted Bennett to hear it coming, wanted him to understand that escape was impossible. Bennett's lungs burned as he ran, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. But the creature's presence pressed down on him like a physical weight, a malevolent force that seemed to sap his strength with every step. The forest itself seemed to be working against him. Roots caught his feet, branches blocked his path, and the very air grew thick and oppressive. This place was cursed, tainted by decades of systematic murder and torture. Behind him, the creature's breathing was audible, deep, rhythmic, almost meditative. It was savoring this moment, taking pleasure in the anticipation of what was to come. Bennett realized this chase was just another form of torture designed to maximize fear before the physical agony began. Bennett stumbled over a fallen log and went down hard, his hands scraping against rough bark as he tried to break his fall. The creature's footsteps grew closer, and Bennett could smell its musk, a wild, predatory scent that spoke of violence and death. He rolled behind the log just as the creature appeared in the gap between the trees. Bennett pressed himself against the rotting wood, trying to make himself invisible as the massive form passed by. The creature paused, its head turning slowly as it scanned the area. For a terrifying moment, Bennett thought he had been discovered. The creature's nostrils flared as it tested the air, and its eyes seemed to look directly at his hiding spot. But then it moved on, its heavy footsteps receding into the distance. Bennett waited until the sounds faded completely before emerging from his hiding place. His clothes were torn and bloody from thorns and branches, and his hands shook uncontrollably as he tried to orient himself in the dense forest. The sounds of pursuit had stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the creature's approach had been. Bennett crouched behind a fallen log, his breathing shallow and rapid as he strained to hear any sign of movement. Nothing. The forest had returned to its unnatural quiet, as if even the trees were holding their breath. Bennett's skin crawled with the sensation of being watched, of predatory eyes studying his every move from the shadows. Minutes passed like hours. Bennett remained frozen behind the log, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Then he heard it, a soft rustling in the undergrowth behind him. Not the heavy footsteps of before, but something more subtle, more patient. The creature was stalking him now, moving with the careful precision of something that had all the time in the world. A twig snapped to his left. Bennett spun toward the sound, but saw nothing except darkness between the trees. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized the creature was toying with him, playing a game of cat and mouse before moving in for the kill. Another sound, this time from his right. The soft whisper of something large moving through the undergrowth with predatory grace. Bennett's head whipped back and forth, trying to track the creature's position, but it seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The creature was circling him, Bennett realized, moving through the forest with supernatural stealth, studying its prey before deciding how to proceed. This was part of the torture, the psychological terror that preceded the physical agony. Bennett tried to move quietly through the undergrowth, but every step seemed to make noise that echoed through the forest like gunshots. Twigs snapped under his feet, branches rustled as he pushed past them, and his labored breathing seemed loud enough to wake the dead. The creature was hurting him, Bennett realized with growing horror. Every time he tried to move in one direction, he would hear sounds that drove him back. The creature was using the forest itself as a trap, channeling him towards some predetermined destination. Then Bennett saw them, two glowing eyes watching him from the darkness between the trees. Ancient, malevolent, filled with an intelligence that was more terrifying than any animal instinct. The creature had been there all along, observing, waiting, savoring the fear it was causing. The eyes moved closer, and Bennett could make out the massive shape behind them. The creature was approaching slowly, deliberately, taking its time to build terror before the real work began. Bennett tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. Terror had frozen him in place, leaving him helpless as the creature emerged from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh. 12 feet of muscle and malevolence, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light. Its proportions were wrong in ways that hurt to look at. Arms too long, hands too large, a face that combined human intelligence with animal savagery. The creature stopped just outside arm's reach, studying Bennett with those ancient eyes. Its expression was one of satisfaction, like an artist contemplating a blank canvas. It had been looking forward to this moment, planning exactly how it would demonstrate its methods on this new victim. Bennett found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. The creature tilted its massive head as if considering his plea. Then it reached out with one enormous hand, its claws extended toward Bennett's face. Bennett's paralysis finally broke. He rolled to the side just as those claws swept through the air where his head had been. The creature's reflexes were lightning fast, but Bennett's desperate terror gave him a burst of adrenaline that sent him scrambling through the undergrowth. The creature roared, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the forest. It was no longer playing games. The hunt had begun in earnest. Bennett crashed through the forest with desperate energy, branches whipping at his face and roots trying to trip him with every step. Behind him, the creature's pursuit was relentless. Heavy footsteps that seemed to shake the ground, the sound of trees being pushed aside like saplings. But Bennett had one advantage. He was smaller, more agile, able to squeeze through gaps in the undergrowth that the massive creature had to force its way through. He used every trick he could think of, doubling back on his trail, splashing through streams to mask his scent, climbing over fallen logs that might slow his pursuer. The chase continued for what felt like hours. Bennett's lungs burned, his legs ached, and his clothes were torn to shreds by thorns and branches. But still he ran, driven by the knowledge of what awaited him if the creature caught up. Bennett found himself in a maze of fallen trees, their massive trunks creating a natural obstacle course that he navigated with desperate agility. Behind him, he could hear the creature forcing its way through the barriers, snapping branches and crushing undergrowth with its immense strength. He squeezed through a gap between two fallen logs, his torn shirt catching on the rough bark. The creature's roar of frustration echoed behind him as it struggled to follow through the narrow opening. Bennett had gained precious seconds, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. Ahead, he spotted a steep ravine cutting through the forest floor. Without hesitation, Bennett leaped across the gap, landing hard on the far side and rolling to absorb the impact. The creature appeared at the edge of the ravine moments later, its eyes blazing with fury at being momentarily thwarted. But the creature was far from defeated. With a powerful leap that defied its massive size, it cleared the ravine effortlessly, landing with a thunderous impact that shook the ground beneath Bennett's feet. Gradually, the sounds of pursuit began to fade. Bennett allowed himself to hope that he had lost the creature, that somehow he had managed to escape the nightmare that had claimed so many others. He stumbled into another clearing, his legs finally giving out from exhaustion. As he struggled to catch his breath, he found himself surrounded by more evidence of the creature's work. Personal belongings scattered like leaves in the wind. A wallet, leather cracked and stained, but still intact. Inside, a driver's license, dirty and weathered, but readable. The name, Marcus Holloway. Address, Grimhaven. Bennett recognized it immediately. Holloway had vanished just 3 weeks ago with his entire crew. Near the wallet lay pieces of clothing matching exactly what Holloway's wife had described to search teams. A red and black flannel shirt, now shredded and blood-soaked. Steel-toed work boots with deep claw gouges. Heavy denim jeans torn apart with such violence they looked like they'd been fed through a wood chipper. The clothing told a story of prolonged struggle. The shirt was torn in patterns that suggested the victim had been held down while the creature worked. Bloodstains showed where major arteries had been opened, but not immediately. The creature had kept its victim alive for as long as possible. But the most chilling discovery was Holloway's work ID badge, still clipped to what remained of his shirt. The plastic was cracked and filthy, but the photo was visible, a smiling man in his 30s with kind eyes and a full beard. The badge identified him as a Thornwick Timber Company employee. Bennett stared at that photo, realizing he was looking at someone who had experienced the same systematic torture he just witnessed being inflicted on the deer. Holloway had been kept conscious as his bones were broken one by one, had felt every moment of agony as the creature demonstrated its refined methods of causing pain. This wasn't an abstract case anymore. This was a man with a family, a life, dreams, all ended by a creature that viewed human suffering as entertainment. Holloway's wife was still waiting for news, not knowing her husband's remains were scattered in this cursed clearing. Searching frantically, Bennett found more evidence. Another wallet containing James Morrison's ID, a logger who disappeared 2 months earlier. His safety vest and hard hat lay nearby, destroyed with the same savage violence. The hard hat was crushed flat, bearing claw marks that had punched through the reinforced plastic like paper. Morrison's belongings told the same story of prolonged torture. His work gloves were shredded, suggesting he'd tried to defend himself. His belt buckle was bent and twisted, indicating the creature had taken time to remove clothing piece by piece, prolonging the victim's terror and humiliation. The pattern was clear now. The creature had been systematically hunting logging crews, taking them one by one for its twisted experiments. Each personal belonging represented an individual tragedy, a person subjected to unimaginable suffering for the creature's pleasure. Bennett found more IDs, more personal effects. David Chen, missing 4 months. Robert Williams, gone 6 months. Thomas Anderson, vanished 8 months ago. Each man's belongings told the same story of systematic torture and prolonged death. Among the scattered belongings, Bennett discovered something that made his blood run cold. A small notebook, its pages water-stained and partially illegible, but still readable enough to reveal its contents. It was Morrison's work journal, documenting his final days before the disappearance. The handwriting in the final entry was shaky and desperate, describing how the crew had found evidence that something had been watching them for days, learning their routines and weaknesses. Morrison had written about his growing certainty that whatever was stalking them was planning something terrible. Bennett also found a digital camera among the belongings, its memory card still intact despite the weather damage. When he checked the display, his blood ran cold. The final photos showed massive footprints around the logging camp, claw marks on trees, and in the last image, a blurry but unmistakable shape watching the camp from the tree line. Bennett stuffed the IDs, journal, and camera into his jacket pocket, his hands shaking uncontrollably. If he somehow escaped, these would provide proof of what happened to the missing men. The families deserved to know, even if the truth was too horrible to fully comprehend. A branch snapped behind him. Bennett spun around to see the creature standing at the edge of the clearing, its massive form silhouetted against the dying light. It had found him again, had been watching him discover the evidence of its work. But something was different now. The creature wasn't approaching. It stood perfectly still, studying Bennett with those ancient eyes, as if making some kind of decision. The creature's gaze moved from Bennett to the scattered belongings around him, then back to Bennett's face. There was something almost curious in its expression, as if it was interested in Bennett's reaction to discovering the evidence of its victims. Bennett backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving the creature. One step, then another, moving toward the far edge of the clearing. The creature watched, but didn't follow. For long moments they stared at each other across the clearing, predator and prey locked in a silent standoff. Bennett could see intelligence in those ancient eyes, a calculating awareness that was more terrifying than any mindless animal rage. The creature seemed to be studying Bennett's face, reading his expressions, analyzing his fear and horror at discovering the evidence of its work. There was something almost scientific in its observation, as if Bennett was a specimen being examined for future reference. The standoff stretched on, neither moving, neither breaking eye contact. Bennett could feel sweat running down his back despite the cool mountain air. His muscles were tensed for flight, but something in the creature's posture suggested that running would trigger an immediate and violent response. Then, without warning, the creature turned and melted back into the forest. One moment it was there, a towering presence of malevolence and death. The next, it was gone, as if it had never existed at all. Bennett stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by the scattered belongings of dead men, wondering if he had just experienced a miracle or if the creature was simply playing another game. He didn't wait to find out. Bennett ran through the forest with renewed desperation, following what he hoped was the path back to his investigation camp. The sun was setting, and he knew that darkness would only make his situation worse. The forest seemed to shift and change around him as he ran, familiar landmarks disappearing and new obstacles appearing in his path. Bennett began to suspect that the creature was still manipulating his route, herding him toward some unknown destination. Hours later, exhausted and bleeding from dozens of cuts and scratches, Bennett finally reached his camp. His equipment was still there, undisturbed, as if the creature had no interest in his investigation tools. But as Bennett gathered his gear with shaking hands, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. His tent had been opened, and inside, arranged neatly on his sleeping bag, were items that hadn't been there before. A logger's hard hat, crushed and bearing fresh claw marks. A work glove, torn and stained with blood that was still wet. And most disturbing of all, a Polaroid photograph showing Bennett himself, taken from the shadows while he had been documenting the bone field earlier that day. The message was clear. The creature had been watching him from the beginning, studying him, learning about him. It could have taken him at any time, but it had chosen not to. The question was why. Bennett also found his investigation notes had been disturbed. Pages were missing, and others had been arranged in a specific pattern that seemed to tell a story. The creature had been reading his work, understanding his methods, perhaps even learning from his documentation techniques. Bennett fled the mountains, driving through the night until he reached the safety of civilization. But even then, surrounded by electric lights and human voices, he couldn't shake the feeling that ancient eyes were still watching him from the darkness. His hands shook so violently that he could barely grip the steering wheel. Every shadow seemed to hide a massive form. Every sound made him jump. The creature's presence had left a mark on him that went deeper than physical wounds. It had touched something primal in his mind, awakening fears that civilization had tried to bury.